In the next few videos after this one, we're going to talk about some particular families that I want to highlight, either because they're really important in Alabama, or they're economically or ethnobotanically important, or because you're going to be looking for them or seeing them a lot in your plant collections or for the plant bingo projects. But before we get into those specific families, I want to start out with a very general overview of kind of a map of where we're going to be going. And so this phylogenetic tree, which shows basically all of life in a very, very crude phylogenetic tree, I want to first, this is going to be our kind of map for how we're going to go forward. Now, if you look at this level, we've got bacteria and archaea all the way out to animals, and everything here with a little asterisk. So some bacteria, some euglena, some red algae, dinoflagellates, everything with a little asterisk next to its name here, photosynthesize. So if we're thinking about what a plant is, it's not just the plants that we're going to be studying, but it's a whole bunch of other things that will also do photosynthesis. Now, bacteria are not considered plants, and neither are euglenoids, but we'll kind of ignore that fact for now. We're going to focus entirely on just the plants, the vascular and typically flowering plants, and we'll not worry about algae of different varieties. So when we think about plants, I want you to think about sort of traditional plants, but recognize that there's other things that also do photosynthesis and therefore are kind of plant-like. So what I'm going to do with this phylogenetic tree is we're going to just kind of take this point and expand it in the next slide. And so here are those plants or plant things that are more traditional plants. And you see, as you expand that one point, the one thing that all of these technically plants have in common is they have roots, and they do photosynthesis. And other than that, club mosses, equisetum, which are horsetails, which are plants that you might see if you're near wet areas. There's a few other things that we consider plants that do not actually have leaves. And then another major milestone in the evolution of plants was the formation of actual leaves. And only some plants have that. So again, horsetails don't have this, but everything else beyond that has leaves. And then not everything has seeds. So the evolution, this new sort of innovation that these plants had was to produce seeds, and then we're going to expand just the seed plant area. So we're going to ignore horsetails and other things that were in this not old, but this other group here. We're going to expand just the seed plants. So plants that actually make seeds include a variety of things. If you're in the Mobile or area of Alabama or any place down south, you're going to see a lot of cycads. Florida has a lot of these cycads. These are ancestral plants that produce seeds. There are ginkgos, which of course we have on campus. There's pines, which we have on campus. These are non-flowering plants, but they're still plants that have seeds. So they have included embryos in some seed structure. If we take just the conifers, which is a small subset of that last phylogenetic tree, so we started off with a wide variety of a bunch of different kinds of organisms, and then we focused just on plants, and then of the plants we focused just on seeding plants. Now we're just taking one small area known as the conifers, or the plants that make cones. There's only about 600 current living species of conifers. And you know examples of some conifers, and we'll talk about those later on when we deal with families of plants that are conifers. But there's not very many of those. There's only around 600 species currently. Most of these conifers are trees and shrubs. They may be monoecious or dioecious, but they're not usually, and maybe not even ever, hermaphroditic. Um, there's an ancestral split between the pines, or the Pinaceae, and all remaining conifers, and we'll talk about that again when we get to those specific groups or those families. The unique things about conifers are that the embryos are formed within these scales, which are on cones, and they're pretty much out in the open. And so these are often thought of as the gymnosperms, because gymno again means naked or out in the open. So we've got this phylogenetic tree of the seed-bearing plants, or the plants that make seeds. And if we expand this a little bit, we've already kind of mentioned cycads, ginkgos, and pines, and I didn't talk about neophytes. It's a relatively small group. Let's just expand the flowering plants. So when we talk about flowering plants, we don't have to go through all of these different groups, but some of these are going to be kind of uh, familiar to you. For example, uh, if you're around wet areas, there are these plants that, okay, honestly, they're probably not very familiar to you, but you'll see them around wetland areas. These things are called paleoherbs. They're neither monocots nor dicots, and they're just sort of paleo because they're older. They're ancestral group that is distinct from the dicots and monocots, etc. There are the magnolias that include the somewhat familiar groups of plants, the Magnolia genus. Now, note that magnolias are neither monocots nor dicots, just like paleoherbs are neither monocots nor dicots. You've been told before that plants are either monocot or dicot, and that's not the case. Now, most of the things that you'll see are either monocots or dicots, but there are a few things that are sort of outside of that grouping. So those things are the paleoherbs, and we'll cover some of those later, and then also members of the magnolia lineage. The more familiar plants to you, maybe you haven't seen this specific species of plant, but the more familiar plants to you are the ones known as eudicots, or the U part means true, so these are the true dicots. That differentiates them from these paleoherbs. And then we have the monocots. Now the monocots have a lot of traits that sort of set them apart, and the reason why those traits set them apart is because they had an ancestor that had those traits, and then all of the ancestors have those traits. So we'll talk about what some of those traits are that hold monocots together as a phylogenetic group when we get to that point. In the monocots, we've got a bunch of things that hold together as the commelinids. So we're going to cover just a few of these because there's not a lot that we need to go into here, but you'll notice that the grasses are in this lineage, the Poales, which will include all the things in the genus Poa. And then a bunch of other different kinds of monocots, the lilies, things like asparagus will be in this lineage. So we've got two sort of major lineages among the monocots. Again, we'll expand these lineages later on when we cover specifically the monocots. And then when we get to dicots, the angiosperms, there's a whole bunch. Most of the diversity of plants is in this group, the angiosperms. These are the seed-bearing, flowering plants. There's 257,000 plus living species. They are by far the most abundant. Many of these, the relationships are unclear. They're still being worked out. And this is a relatively old group, 120 million years ago, but they really expanded and diversified substantially, in part because they make flowers. And the making of flowers is a unique adaptation among these flowering plants, the angiosperms, because now they've got the possibility of coevolution between the plants and the insects that pollinate them, or the bats that pollinate them, or the flowers or the wind that pollinates them. So again, if we go sort of back up, what we're going to do, this is a roadmap for where we're going to go. We're going to expand some of these monocots. We're going to expand some of these gymnosperms. We're going to talk more about these, and I want to just try to highlight some of these dicots as we start to expand and explore some of the plant families that you're going to be seeing.